Hello Internet, and welcome to another installment of Interesting History. Today I'm gonna be moving away from the Vikings before we get, a little bit too stuck in the Nordic traditions and moving over to early Norman England. So we are dealing with, ancestors of Vikings instead, because I am apparently incapable of letting completely go of that particular thing. More specifically, I am going to talk about the early centuries of the Norman rule of Great Britain, well, of England at least, and how a single shipwreck that we actually know phenomenally little about caused a almost 20-year civil war. So yeah, enjoy. In the 1050s, Edward the Confessor was King of England. Edward was a fairly successful king in his way, but he was childless and thus had no heir. He did, however, have a cousin, the Duke of Normandy, Guillaume II, who felt like he would be just the right guy to succeed Edward as King of England and tried throughout the decade to have Edward make him his heir. Unfortunately, for Guillaume at any rate, a lot of other people also found that they would be just the guy to become King of England. And so when Edward died very early in the year 1066, he left the throne to a certain Harold Godwinson, who was the Earl of Wessex, probably the most powerful nobleman in England at the time, and a cousin of the Danish king Sven Estridsson, thus both of them being heirs to the great Canute, who had ruled the North Sea Empire 40 years prior. Harold was, of course, to become the last ruling Anglo-Saxon king of England, and his reign wasn't lasting long, because in September of that year, another one who thought that he would be just a guy to be King of England, namely Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, invaded England with his Viking army, and Harold gathered up his forces and moved north, and in Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire, he managed to defeat the Vikings, and thereby ending, at least officially, the Viking Age. Now, sadly for Harold, something has happened in the south, because while he was busy fighting Vikings in Yorkshire, Guillaume had become tired of waiting for at least someone to die of natural causes so he could be the guy to be the King of England, and said, screw it, I will take my own army, move over, and he made landfall on the south coast of England. On a side note, this Duke Guillaume was the great-great-grandson of a certain Rollo, or Rolf perhaps, who was a Viking raider who had settled in Normandy and become its duke, and who might have been the cousin of the famous Ragnar Lothbrok that I have mentioned earlier. So yeah, I can't seem to let the Vikings go entirely. Anyway, faced with this new threat, Harold Godwinson had little choice but to take his now tired and battle-weary forces to rush south to try to intercept Guillaume before he did all too much trouble for him. And on the 14th of October 1066, the two armies met at Hastings in Sussex. The battle is, of course, incredibly famous. It is mostly from the Bayeux Tapestry, and this was where Harold was killed, and Guillaume's forces destroyed the native armies and overran the kingdom. Guillaume became king and was eventually known as William the Conqueror, though some of his contemporaries called him William the Bastard, though probably when his back was turned, since he might not have appreciated it, though it was actually true, considering the fact that his father never actually had any children with his wife, and William was the son of one of his father Robert's many mistresses. So, William had conquered England. Sadly for him, the old existing Anglo-Saxon nobility didn't particularly like being conquered by a bunch of northern-descended Frenchmen, so William had to spend a lot of time fighting rebellions during his early years, using up, in fact, most of his resources on nearly endless battles. At the same time, things back in Normandy wasn't too good either. William's son Robert, who had sided with the French king to grab power in his father's duchy during William's absence, was causing trouble, so William had to maintain a standing army in Normandy as well as in England, using up various resources. So in 1087, William returned to Normandy to chastise his son Good, but unfortunately died there in the same year following a riding accident. At William's death, he was survived by the 8 children he had with his wife Matilda of Flanders. Now, let me just warn everyone who's listening to this. The name Matilda will come up a lot in this video. It was apparently the only name that people were allowed in the Norman English nobility to give their daughters at this time. So if things start to get a bit confusing, I apologize in advance because there will be a lot of them. However, the more specifically, the interesting children that William left behind was Robert, another William, and Henry. Those 3 were important because William's will split his resources and kingdom between them. The oldest surviving son, Robert, called Curthose, or short pants, because he was very low and thus needed fairly short pants, received Normandy, and William, called Rufus, meaning the red because his red face, he might be a drunkard, got the kingdom of England, while the last kid, Henry, was given a lump sum of money. However, the peace between the brothers did not last, as Robert and William did not agree on who was supposed to rule England or how the whole thing was to be divided. And so there was civil war between the brothers, which happened a lot at the time. Brother was, quite frankly, brother worst during the early Plantagenet dynasty. In 1100, William Rufus died when he was accidentally shot by an arrow on a hunt, possibly murdered by the last brother Henry, though there's absolutely no evidence for it. It's just that he mostly got things out of it, as he then immediately usurped the throne of England before Robert could get to it. After further years of battle between the 2 brothers, the war finally ended in 1806 when the 2 had a battle at Tinchebray, and Henry caught Robert and imprisoned him in Devizes Castle and left him there to rot. Almost 20 years later, he then showed a bit of mercy by moving him to another castle and leaving him there to rot until his death in 1134. But with Robert in prison and William dead, Henry had no immediate rivals for the English throne, and thus was secure in his position as King of England, though his immediate rule had, of course, lost a good deal of influence in Normandy, with Robert having governed that for most of the last 20 years. To shore up his position during his younger years, Henry had decided to marry well, so he had married the daughter of King Malcolm of Scotland. The woman's name was, surprisingly enough, Matilda, and as a descendant of Alfred the Great of England and as a granddaughter of Edmund Ironside, she had links to the old Anglo-Saxon royalty and thus were used to strengthen Henry's claim to the throne in latter years. Matilda was quite a bit younger than Henry, and they had 3 children. Now, Henry traveled a lot around the country, while Matilda preferred to stay at the court in Westminster, and that meant that Henry had a lot of chances to, well, father bastards, because that was a famous pastime of the kings at the time. So, at the time that he later died, he left behind at least 22 illegitimate children that he had, recognized and supported. vigorous man, you gotta say. Like his father and older brother's reign, Henry's time as king was categorized by rebellions and war. He was especially on really bad terms with King Louis of France, since he was, after all, supposed to be King Louis's vassal as Duke of Normandy, and spent a lot of time in Normandy fighting Louis. In fact, he was there in 1118 when his wife Matilda died, Henry's wife, that is, and since his oldest son Richard had died a bit earlier, this left Henry with only 2 surviving legitimate children and no wife, namely specifically a son named William Adelin and a daughter called, can you guess it? You are right, Matilda. And this Matilda will be incredibly important later. When this Matilda was 6 or 7, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, or Heinrich V, proposed to her, and Henry accepted, and she was eventually married and became Holy Roman Empress, which is the title she's known for today, Empress Matilda or Empress Maud. Sadly, this fairly happy marriage didn't last long, as Heinrich died fairly young and Matilda returned to her father in England as a young widow. Now, I mentioned that Henry spent a lot of time fighting King Louis of France, and in 1119 he managed to persuade one of King Louis's most powerful allies, Fulk, Count of Anjou, to change to Henry's side by promising him that Fulk's daughter, guess what she was called, would marry Henry's surviving son William. Also, Fulk would receive a rather large bag of money. And together, Fulk and Henry then defeated King Louis in battle, and the war slowly came to an end with a treaty the year after in 1120, where Louis recognized William Adelin as Duke of Normandy, while Henry sort of then acknowledged Louis as his titular overlord. So there was peace now, with Henry having achieved most of his goals. However, this was when the trouble really started. Following the Peace of 1120, Henry and William Adelin was supposed to return to England from Normandy, and Thomas Fitzstephen, a very accomplished sea captain and in fact the son of William the Conqueror's old sea commander, offered Henry transport back to England on his brand new ship known as the White Ship. The king turned down the offer, as he had already made other plans and sailed in the morning for Britain. He allowed, though, that a large number of his retinue, including William Adelin and 2 of his other illegitimate children, a Richard and, guess it, a Matilda, took ship with Fitzstephen's. According to the stories, the ship left France in the late afternoon with 300 people aboard, and decided that since it was new and really fast, they would try to catch up to Henry and overtake him to Britain. Again, stories go that the crew had asked William Adelin for a bit of booze to get in the mood, and that he had obliged with so much wine that basically everyone aboard was stone blind drunk. Which might be the reason that just outside the harbor, the White Ship hit a submerged rock that basically tore up the entire port side. The ship filled with water and capsized in very few minutes. And since most of the crew was very drunken at the time, you didn't know how to swim. There was confusion, panic, and drownings. Adelin managed to save himself on a small boat, but again, the story goes that when he heard his half-sister cry for help, he ordered the boat to turn back to try and save her, but the number of people trying to get on board the raft managed to capsize it, and everyone, including William, drowned. Thomas Fitzstephen himself went down with the vessel, but struggled back up to the surface. He apparently knew how to swim, but when he learned that William Adelin was dead, he let himself slip under and drown, as he was apparently not willing to face King Henry rather than tell him that his son was dead. There are several mysteries concerning the White Ship disaster. Like, why would such an experienced captain as Thomas Fitzstephen allow his crew to get stone blind drunk on what was supposed to be basically a night voyage with the British Crown Prince on board? And if William was so attached to his sister, why didn't he bring her aboard the skiff in the first place? But anyway, there is no real evidence, and I'm not trying to convey any conspiracy theories here. Fact is, William Adelin was dead, and this left Henry completely without any legitimized male descendants and thus no heir to the throne. Most of the latter part of his reign was basically Henry trying to figure out what to do with this succession crisis. He had his daughter Matilda, the Empress, eventually marrying the son of the aforementioned Fulk of Anjou, a fellow called Geoffrey, and tried to have his barons swear loyalty to Matilda so she could inherit the throne. But the British barons were not keen on having a woman as a ruler, so Henry tried various other ideas like his nephew Stephen of Blois or various other British noblemen, but eventually still tried to settle on his daughter, the Empress Matilda, as the new ruler of Britain, when he died in 1135. Some of the barons were still not all that keen on having Matilda as the ruler of England, so they then chose the before-mentioned Stephen of Blois to be king of England. However, Matilda felt that she had the greater claim, and of course she felt more entitled to the throne, and basically she felt like she was just the girl to be Queen of England. So we started yet another round of civil wars, namely the particular one lasting for 18 years, known as the Anarchy. The Civil War sadly almost immediately turned into a stalemate, with Stephen and his loyal barons controlling the southeastern part of England with his capital of London, while Matilda and her forces controlled the southwestern part, though her capital, if you want to call it that, was still with her husband back in Normandy. In 1141, Stephen himself was taken prisoner after the Battle of Lincoln, and Matilda was ready to let herself be crowned as queen in London, but sadly the local population, which was siding with Stephen, drove her out of the town, and before she could find herself another place to be crowned, there was another battle, the Battle of Winchester, where Robert of Gloucester, Matilda's brother and primary army commander, was taken prisoner by Stephen's army. Since Stephen was in Matilda's prison, his army was led by his wife, by the name of, I probably don't even need to say it at this time, and the two, Stephen and Robert, was then exchanged, so we were ready for another round of civil war without anyone getting the upper hand, though our Matilda, if you want to call her that, the Empress, did eventually had to perform a daring night escape over a frozen Thames River when the forces of Stephen had besieged her in Oxford. Eventually, Matilda got tired of the whole thing, and leaving her 15-year-old son, called Henry, she returned to her husband in Normandy and never actually returned to Britain again. The younger Henry then continued the war, but was a bit unsuccessful, and Stephen eventually managed to drive him out of England, seemingly sealing his victory. However, he then tried to get his son Eustace recognized as the next king of England after himself, but since the church and the barons didn't particularly want him, it gave the younger Henry a chance to invade again, and basically, well, we were back to square one. However, neither party at this time was really interested in continuing a war that was obvious they couldn't win, and in the same summer they came to an agreement where Stephen recognized Henry as his heir rather than his own son, and the civil war came to an end. The next year, Stephen died, and Henry was crowned as Henry II. Henry had a very long and fairly successful reign, of England, though his last years was marred by, well, you guessed it, conflict between his sons, who decided that they were all the right man to rule England. I will spare you this particular rebellion and civil war, though, as we are dealing here with the famous Richard the Lionheart, John Lackland, and those particular brothers, and their stories are well known and can be read a lot of other places. Matilda herself survived for fairly long after Henry had been crowned king and was ruling Normandy with her husband at the time, until it reverted to Henry upon her death. So, that was the early Norman rulers of England. If anything can be taken from that, is don't go on a night sail with a crew that's absolutely stone blind drunk if you happen to be the Crown Prince of England. Stop naming your children Matilda, since it gets really confusing.
Well,
and perhaps
you enjoyed
at
that
least
little
try to keep
dissertation
some
about the
peace
early
between your children,
Norman
so they
rulers
don't
of
spend
England.
all
I
the
admit
time
there wasn't any
fighting civil
particular
wars against each
single
other.
thing or any particular single person I wanted to talk about this time. I just always found these particular first 100 years after the Norman conquest to be really interesting, and something that few people actually know about. When we get to, again, the Crusades with Richard the Lionheart and Robin Hood and so on, most everyone knows about it. The Battle of Hastings is fairly well known, at least, but the 150 years between the two affairs are really, really fascinating, and something that people really should know about. It's something, well, yeah, experience it. So, until next time, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.